Well, hello everyone, and a very, very warm welcome to this first webinar from the Foundation of Integrated Transport. My name's Roger French, and it's my pleasure to chair this event in my capacity as a trustee of the Foundation for Integrated Transport. And my first duty is to explain the running order and say a few words about the foundation itself. So let me explain that we've got two very eminent speakers today to speak to us about transport appraisal and carbon. That's Phil Goodwin and John Whitelegg. And they're going to be talking about transport appraisal, whether it is fit for purpose. Each will speak for 15 minutes, after which we're going to have a panel discussion inspired by the questions and the points that we'd be delighted if you're watching this live now, if you could enter into the YouTube chat function, that would be lovely. And we'll pick up the points you make and the questions in the panel discussion. We'll kick off the panel discussion with two 5-minute presentations, one from Jillian Anable and one from Chris Moores. Jillian is Professor of Transport and Energy at the Institute for Transport Studies at the University of Leeds, and Chris is Head of Investment Delivery Planning, Benefits Management at Transport for London. We're very grateful to both Jillian and Chris, as of course we are to Phil and John, and of course all of you who've tuned in live, and also those watching it later on once the recording is up with YouTube in the months and who knows, years ahead. Please do enter your questions and thoughts in the chat, and also tweet about it if you're watching it live as well, because it will all help to raise the profile of the subject. Now, before asking Phil and John, I'd like to speak. I'd like to just say a few words about the Foundation for Integrated Transport, or FIT, as we know it for short. And if the first slide could be put up, please, that would be very helpful. Thank you very much. That's the third slide. So if we could quickly backtrack to the first slide, here we go. Now, as it says there, we're in our 8th year, having been established by the wonderful Dr. Simon Norton, who very sadly passed away 3 years ago. I had the pleasure of meeting him many years ago, and his passion for public transport was second to none. I have never known anyone with such a astute mind, and he would literally be able to schedule buses and trains in his head to be able to give a better service. A wonderful, inspirational man. And now, as it says there, what his vision was for a world where we could live with public transport dominating our lives in an integrated and safe manner. And it's summed up very neatly there to say that we would have a right to receive public transport, just as we do to have water. And the next slide will show the 8 strategic priorities that the foundation, which Simon was instigated in setting up before he passed away, the 8 strategic priorities that drive our charitable endeavours. And the final slide will show what we actually do. We're one of the very few, if perhaps almost only, grant-making charities that concentrate on transport, on public transport, on sustainable transport. And you can see that the 4 areas that we do here are grants, small grants, fellowships, and we also invest in fledgling businesses and ideas, innovative schemes that will help to achieve our objectives. Thank you for the slides, Brogan. Now, a few years ago, I was delighted as one of the trustees that we supported our first 2 senior fellows in the form of Phil Goodwin and John Whitelegg. And it's great that we can today all benefit from hearing the results of their research, their studies, and their true wealth of experience in this area of transport appraisal and carbon. I'd now like to introduce both Phil and John, but just before I do, I want to give a quick shout out to my fellow FIT trustee, Lisa Hopkinson, who with the help of our administrator, Madeleine Roberts, has put this webinar together. And we're aiming for this to be the first in a series of sharing the work which FIT is part funding and at the moment and over the last few years. So thanks very much, Lisa, for all your work in putting this together. Now, I'm sure Professor Phil Goodwin will be known to many of you tuning in. He is Emeritus Professor of Transport Policy at both UCL and UWE, following an illustrious career including transport planning at the GLC, Director of Oxford University Transport Studies Unit, Non-Executive Director of the Port of Dover, quite a challenging role at the moment, I would say, as well as being involved in research into road pricing and London's congestion charge. He is, it is fair to say, a renowned expert, and there's no one more qualified to address us on our subject today. Phil, after he's spoken, will hand seamlessly over to John Whitelegg. He's visiting professor of the built environment at Liverpool John Moores University, as well as being an associate of a German transport research organization in Kassel, Germany. He has extensive knowledge of the subject matter, not only in this country, but throughout the world. He's authored 11 books on sustainable transport and related issues, working on projects, as I say, all over the world. He's established the world's first technical standard on reducing demand for transport, and that has been picked up by internationally recognized now. And he is also an advisor to the World Health Organization in Geneva. We're certainly in for a treat to hear from both Phil and John. And without more ado, please give a virtual round of applause and welcome John, who will kick us off and lead us seamlessly into, did I say John then? We'll hand over to Phil, who will seamlessly then hand over to John. So welcome, Phil, and over to you.
Right. Now, I'm hoping you can see my shared screen, is that right?
Yes, we can, Phil.
Good, good. So a word of thanks to FIT from both John and me for the 2 senior fellowships. It's not a single project we're working on, but many different strands of work. And for convenience, we've divided our presentations into 2 of these themes. First, me with a critique of the past and present, especially on roads appraisal. And secondly, John with positive alternatives for the present and future. Of course, you'll understand that in our work, we both actually engage fully with both areas, but it's convenient to divide it up that way for the webinar. To start very briefly about what we mean by appraisal, here that's dominated by the Department for Transport Guidance, TAG, a very elaborate formal system which in principle requires wide consideration of strategic objectives, alternative options for achieving them, assessment of economic and environmental and social aspects, detailed research on costs and benefits of time and safety and damage and pollution and financial impact and equity, and greenhouse gases, especially CO2. In my opinion, there's a lot of good sense in it, in principle. Now, in practice, the Highways Agency, now called National Highways, is both the promoter and the appraiser of the biggest road schemes. Their appraisals are reported using roughly this format, but the content has a quite different focus. And to understand that, we have to go back to the 1950s, when the planning approach we now call predict and provide started to dominate the transport world. It assumes inevitable road traffic growth into the far distant future, mostly by cars. Its central question is how much extra road space is needed to cope with that traffic, and its answers always argue still that more road capacity will reduce or even eliminate congestion. Well, designs like this emerged here and all over the world, and we know what happened. The roads were built and the traffic did grow, but it did not solve congestion. And at the heart of this was the problem of induced traffic. It was a vicious circle, a self-fulfilling prophecy with increasing and unwanted and unpleasant side effects. Towns changed to accommodate cars. Car dependence made it much more difficult to live without a car. Pollution and community severance, effects on health and safety, inequity, social tension, and carbon dioxide. One of the biggest emitters of carbon dioxide is the transport sector. The relationship of carbon dioxide and climate change has been known at the scientific level for about a century and was already a matter of serious government concern in the 1990s, both nationally and internationally, 30 years ago. Many of the policies we'll talk about today were already on the agenda in the 1960s and part of government thinking by the 1990s. Very good intentions. In 2014, the then government adopted a national policy on national networks. I reread it the other day and was surprised how much good advice there is in it, including how carbon emissions should be treated in the appraisal of transport schemes. But the good advice turned out to be outweighed by one short paragraph on page 50, looking as though you'd think was sneaked in under the radar. Certainly its significance only became apparent later. It stated that any one road scheme would only add a small proportion of CO2 to the atmosphere, which is true. And therefore, any increase in carbon emissions from road construction is not a reason to reject road schemes unless, quote, unless the increase in carbon emissions resulting from the proposal is so significant that it would have a material impact on the ability of government to meet its carbon reduction targets. Every word of that is so finely crafted. This is the sentence that provided a loophole to ignore all the good intentions of combating climate change. It is repeated over and over again in support of every scheme promoted by National Highways, always using words like, this road scheme only increases carbon by whatever the number they calculated, 0.01% of the total amount of carbon emitted by everything else. This number could easily be offset by the government's decarbonisation plans. Could, that's the point, not is. And hence we can ignore it. One of my early activities in the fellowship was to provide expert support for the legal challenge by the Transport Action Network, TAN, to this approach, with Jillian Anable, who's here, and Lisa Hopkinson and Lynn Sloman. It went to the High Court. The technical issue was this unique test of insignificance. It was called the doctrine of de minimis. Well, I think we won the technical argument. So I suppose I would say that, wouldn't I? But we lost the legal case specifically about whether the Secretary of State for Transport was breaking the law in following the advice given to him by civil servants using this loophole. So the loophole survives and it's used to this day. Government seems to be shifting its ground on the loophole, and I think there's a good chance it will be abandoned in the current review of national policy now underway. National Highways is resisting that. But meanwhile, we see the absurd situation of this formula, this appraisal footnote, still being used to dismiss the importance of carbon in road appraisal, at the same time as nearly every other arm of policy is stating the need to take it more seriously, not less. For example, DEFRA, following the Treasury's revision of its generic rules of appraisal, now recommends that strategic appraisal should also consider the effects of a 2 degrees or 4 degrees increase in global average temperature, not only the 1.5 degrees that we're committed to. What that means was considered by the august Office for Budget Responsibility, who last year started talking about the risks of climate change that go far beyond a bit more sun and a bit more rain. It was almost a relief to read the honesty of its discussion last year of the increasing likelihood of extreme events, conflict, war, mass migration, disease patterns, civil unrest, governance breakdown, insurance failures, systemic financial crises, and economic instability. Transport appraisal simply assumes that such a world will never exist and therefore does not have to be considered. The enormous costs of climate change are partly reflected in the much higher values of carbon that are supposed to be included in the cost-benefit studies, now recommended, quite rightly, by BASE, the Government Department for Business, Science and Industrial Strategy, and by the DFT. National Highways are delaying using the new values instead of the old ones. For example, in one controversial scheme that I've been engaged in, the one at Stonehenge, the already pitifully low benefits of their predicted time savings would actually be made, would actually be made negative with the new carbon values. So we now have a situation where we have to appraise climate change in two quite different ways. First, we have the effects of climate change on transport, economic and social operating conditions, needs and constraints and demand. And this changes the baseline forecasts. That is, what would happen if we just let present trends continue without intervention. It would mean we need different sorts of transport in different places, different materials, different weather conditions, an entirely different sort of appraisal. And the second issue is the opposite, the effects of transport on climate change by CO2 production. This must include both the direct and the indirect emissions of CO2 in the short and the long run, including any land use, lifestyle, and activity results of transport decisions. I think we're only just starting to take that seriously. What happens in transport can make climate change better or worse. The trajectory we are now on still is a trajectory that makes climate conditions worse. In these conditions, the loophole logically doesn't work, because the decarbonisation strategy depends on a reduction in traffic, not the increase which has been predicted. You cannot simultaneously assume that decarbonisation will have no effects on traffic growth when forecasting the need for road building, but 100% success of decarbonisation when discounting the need for any considering any carbon consequences. And what we now can do is imagine two different futures, work that Jillian and I have been doing. One future is that of runaway climate change, which is a future with devastating impacts, not only on transport, but also on all social and economic life. And that's a future of reduced standards of living, reduced incomes. It will transform economic geography and consequentially travel patterns. And here's the point for appraisal. It's not conceivably a future of unlimited traffic growth. And the other future is if we are able to change the trajectory of climate change, it will mean a deep reduction in fossil fueled road traffic and a shift from all car use to public transport, walking, cycling, and land use planning to assist that. This should also bring non-climate economic advantages, reduce congestion, better health, which will enter into the appraisal. But that also is not a future of traffic growth. Neither possible future is one of indefinite traffic growth. So let's return to my opening slide, predict and provide. Its whole point was that increasing car use is inevitable. Everything else followed from that. Now we are arguing the opposite. Indefinitely increasing car use is not just undesirable, but impossible. The conditions under which car use growth turns round may be chosen and life enhancing, or may be forced and disastrous. That's still to be determined, but one way or another, those are the two courses which are open to us. So to return to the legacy of predict and provide, every step in its logic is faulty. It is saying that climate conditions will not change transport needs much, and transport policies will not change the climate much. And the irony is that this same appraisal framework, applied properly, actually supports better and cheaper public transport, a reallocation of resources and road capacity to active travel, demand management of traffic by regulation or design or price, using smarter choices and land use planning to encourage mode shift and shifting destinations. That work and practical experience is already known, it's already available, which is my cue to hand over to John for the next step in the argument. Thank you very much for your attention. Now I have to stop the share.
Hello, everybody. If we can put up my PowerPoint presentation, please, we'll get cracking immediately. Okay, it's a great pleasure to be able to take part in this discussion and to follow Phil. And Phil has set the scene perfectly for what I am trying to do. And what I'm trying to do is basically to explore what I regard as the richness and the wealth, the good news, the affordability, the practicality, the wide benefits of the world that is on offer if we do appraisal properly. We can do appraisal properly. I will probably get into lots of hot water, which I'm quite used to, but we don't do it properly at all. And I was a consultant on the original web-based transport appraisal guidance. And we set out very clearly that this transport appraisal guidance should encourage the widest possible scoping and consideration of the widest possible alternatives to solving specifically defined transport problems, and should not peddle a particular preferred solution. Next slide, please. A rather obvious starting point for my discussion, and I apologise for the fact that in 15 minutes it might be a bit rushed, but I'm very happy to answer questions on any aspect of this. My starting point is that I see this whole thing as a bit like a Russian doll. I'm very fond of the Russian doll image metaphor. And the outer bit, the outer doll, the bigger thing that lots of other things sit inside, is called intelligent, determined government and policy that sets out a course of action, which it does every year without fail for 10 or 20 years to achieve certain objectives. It doesn't lurch from one position to another position with inviting bids for various things like building better buses or something. And even though there is no such thing as a perfect world, I do argue that Germany, and I've worked extensively in Germany, including 3 years as a German civil servant, that Germany does the zero carbon transport transition. They've even got a nice phrase for it, Verkehrswende. Everyone in Germany laughed at my German, so I won't dwell on that. But they have a whole philosophy, theory, practicality, methodology about a total transformation of transport. Next slide, please. And the part of the agreed policy direction, the destination that we're heading for, is this decarbonisation scenario, where car availability is limited and the share of public transport goes up to 66% of all journeys every day. This varies a lot by geography, large cities like Berlin or smaller towns and cities, and so on and so on. You know, so there is a geographical element to indicate that it isn't one size fits all. But the outer doll is intelligent government that regards the whole issue of what we spend money on and what we prioritise has to be seen to deliver on our objectives, which is what appraisal is supposed to be. Next slide, please. I don't have time in this presentation to go into lots of detail I would like to, but I find a comparison between a city in southern Germany, Freiburg, and a city which Phil Goodwin knows far more about than I do, Oxford, to be quite instructive. And if you just look at I'm not going to go into any of the detailed numbers here. If you look at the red blob at the bottom of Freiburg, you see that car-based transport, car passengers, car single occupancy vehicles are around 20–21%. And in Oxford, which has done better than many other cities in Britain, it's much more, it's twice that much. So basically, in a German city context, planning context, the things Phil talked about, land use planning, transport planning, budgets, promoting public transport, promoting walking and cycling, tend to go in lockstep with each other and deliver actual results. And when you're delivering actual results, you're delivering appraisal. And we don't do that in the UK. Next slide, please. Another good example place, because what I'm trying to emphasize in this presentation is that I think appraisal is seriously flawed, if not non-existent in the United Kingdom. But it could do a lot better. It could indeed do a lot better, and we don't have to grope around in the dark. There are other ways of proceeding to deliver the benefits of appraisal. And the city of Lund, L-U-N-D, Lund in southern Sweden, has invented this amazing Lundamats, which is version 3 they're on now, which is a totally integrated land use, transport, mobility, budgeting system for reducing it's demand management, for reducing the amount of car traffic. And if you go on the Lund website or even Google Lundamats, you'll find out lots of stuff. Next slide, please. There isn't time, you'll be very pleased to hear, there isn't time to go around this very nice diagram, but the Lund plan, and this goes back to my point about the outer doll in the Russian doll metaphor, mode share will be 75% by walk, cycle, public transport. End of story. That's what it will be. It's not a case of, by the way, we need a new road, by the way, we'd like a bypass, by the way, we need to get rid of congestion, let's build a bypass. Mode share will be 75%. And that's within the urban area for normal everyday trips within the urban area, and the in and out traffic, because they make a geographical differentiation between travel within Lund and travel in and out of Lund. It will be 50%. So my main experience is Germany and Sweden, but there are many other countries which do similar things, Denmark and the Netherlands, for example. Next slide, please. I like pretty pictures. I'm an unreformed 1960s geographer. Pretty pictures. This is the residential area called Vauban in Freiburg in the state of Baden-Württemberg in southern Germany. And Vauban is extremely well described in the literature. but I want to chuck this in immediately as a sign of real intelligence. So about 10 or 12,000 people live here, and before any accommodation whatsoever was given permission to be constructed in Vauban, the city authorities and the state authorities insisted on providing a tram system, which would go in first. I have yet to find any sign of the intelligence brain cell in the United Kingdom, which links housing development, new housing, tens of thousands, 30,000, 40,000 new houses, links it to some clear, strategic, intelligent thinking about how people will move around when they get there. Next slide, please. Similarly, this again is Freiburg. I shouldn't witter on about Freiburg extensively, but what this is an original road bridge replaced by a pedestrian cycling bridge. This big circular thing is a cycling centre, a cycling hub, and cyclists all over Britain know very well the joys of eating lots of nice food. So there's a nice cafe there, bicycle parking for several hundred. So basically cycling is a real thing that is really promoted and really supported. And if you all had time, and you're very lucky that we don't have time, I would love to walk around where I'm sitting at the moment in Shrewsbury and show you the pathetic, absolutely disgraceful bits of coloured tarmac on the streets and the highly inadequate cycling and walking facilities. And to say that cycling is in any way supported or promoted in Shrewsbury is just laughable. This is how it can be supported. Next slide, please. Munstertal is a rural area. I'm fascinated by rural public transport. Look at the enormous distance between the train and the bus. Look at the fact that you can do that on the level. And the total integration, this is part of what I was talking about earlier, which is the Gesamtverkehrsplan or the Verkehrswende. You know, when you talk about the detail, sustainable transport is a broad, overgeneralized expression. The detail matters. And when you have a transport system like Munstertal, in southern Germany, there's high levels of use of public transport because it is so easy and so simple and so efficient. And once again, this has a direct link with appraisal. I repeat what I said at the start. Appraisal is about having a wide net and to pull together all the options, all the different ways we can intervene, being really clear about all our objectives and our aspirations, pulling everything together and being intelligent and making sure that what we do actually reinforces and helps to deliver what we want to do. And that's how appraisal should work. And in the UK, it sits in a separate box as a bit of a technical kind of nice thing that we pretend we do when we want to justify a road scheme. And that is totally unacceptable. Next slide, please. So we can, a bit of a summary, I suppose. We can do things so much better. We still need big improvements in appraisal. But back to the Russian doll, we have to get several other things in place as well. The outer doll, we have to have an intelligent, highly focused, consistent, objective-led transport planning system like Lund, like Freiburg, like Tallinn in Estonia with its free public transport, like car-free housing in Vauban in Germany. Another place I'm impressed with, I recently visited Oslo, car-free city, the capital of Norway. And we can walk around a city that's bigger than Leeds or bigger than Newcastle or bigger than Manchester, and you don't see many vehicles. It works and it's economically very successful. We can have significant behavioural change. Another project I did at the York Intelligent Transport Project shows that we can actually do a number of things highly coordinated in sequence and get people out of cars, back to demand management. And this strange acronym, this strange title, mobility as a service. Next, please. I don't have time, you'll be very pleased to hear, to talk about mobility as a service. But if we're talking about appraisal, back to what is appraisal? Back to what we did 10, 15 years ago when we did a consultancy project to design WebTag. We said there has to be a wide net, a widespread consideration of all the options and all the alternatives. And that includes fiscal stuff, like road pricing, but it includes behavioural change and mobility as a service. I've recently been part of my foundation work as well, annoying people in Stockholm, looking at their mobility as a service program. So everybody has full information on all modes of transport, all the information, all the carbon implications of how they travel, all the cost implications, all the time implications, and they can choose. And if they want to buy a bus or a train ticket, it helps them to do that. It's a totally integrated behavioural change system that's dead easy. And I know the West Midlands, where I'm sitting at the moment, are experimenting with mobility as a service. Correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we have anything like this up and running in Britain. And it is an alternative to road building. It's a real alternative. Next slide, please. It can be done well. The good news is I'm moving towards my conclusion. We can do all the things I've far too briefly flagged up in my presentation so far. We can do all these things in the same place, at the same time, and timetabled. We can have a system with no more road building at all, because we're going to reallocate public spending to the best practice alternatives, accessibility for all, social justice for all, value for money, health gains. Another thing I've done as part of my fellowship, before the fellowship started, I had another horrible acronym, GAPA, Global Action Plan on Physical Activity. Far more important, far more impressive than any of this kind of greenwash that comes out of active travel plans from central government in the United Kingdom, and zero carbon. And we can have a significant upgrade in the use of science, evidence, best practice, and we should follow, the next slide please, the Nolan principles. Now, again, it would be wrong to digress on Nolan, but we do actually have principles of public life in England, and we are supposed to follow rules about objectivity, accountability, and openness. I can tell everyone taking part in this webinar today, and I've taken part, I lose track, I lose the will to live, between 10 and 20 public inquiries into road schemes. Not one of them has had any objectivity, any accountability, or any openness. All of them have said, this will solve congestion, this will create jobs, this will encourage walking, this will encourage cycling. It is simply not true. So we do not follow the Nolan principles, and we should do. Next slide, please. Okay, so we need to find ways, and here I confess my own inadequacy. We need to find ways to base our thinking and spending on evidence, best practice, and evaluation. And once again, as a colleague of mine, a professor of transport in Denmark said, memorably said, I admire British transport policy. It is fantastic. The evidence is fantastic. The discussions are fantastic. We have none of that in Denmark. We just do it right on the ground. We don't need all these reports about induced traffic, and we don't need all these reports. So basically, we need to get our head round linking science and evidence, induced traffic. Road building doesn't create jobs. The whole time savings thing in benefit cost analysis is a complete sham. I've written about that, and I send that to anybody who wants it. And we need to take account of fiscal responsibility. If we have an urban area, and it applies in rural areas as well, with large amount of trip making, a large modal share for walking, cycling, and buses, for example, the total costs go down. And if we have low modal share for those so-called, whatever called sustainable modes, and a high modal share for cars, the costs go up. And that's public costs and private costs. The system at the moment is stacked against intelligence, consideration, logic, and it will add more carbon and be socially regressive, and it will not produce public health gains. Next slide, please. Now, luckily, again, we don't have time to talk about, this is the Shrewsbury Northwest Relief Road. £90 million on 4.5 miles of nice new road that will solve all the congestion problems in Shrewsbury and will create jobs and a whole number of other things. It won't do anything of the kind. It is a complete sham, a complete tissue of falsehood. Next slide, please. The discussions, by the way, I can be nice to people, and I do talk nicely to people in a friendly way. This is one of the people I talk to, but the view in Shropshire Council, and by the way, this applies in almost every area of England which has the word Shire in its title, in its council title, is that they just simply make up the stories. So this road will reduce carbon. End of story. It will reduce carbon. Next slide, please. and another person who I have nice conversations with, it will produce loads of benefits. It will get rid of traffic insurance, it will improve air quality, improve road safety, people can walk and cycle to school. The cycling plans in Shropshire, again, it's not just a Shropshire point. I've worked in Lancashire, I've worked in many counties in England. It's the same everywhere. Our ability to provide serious, intelligent, best practice cycling network infrastructure to enable children to walk and cycle to school safely is rubbish. So basically, we need the Nolan principles. How do we hold people to account? Next slide, please. Key messages. We need clearly defined objectives linked to backcasting and feeding into budgets. Another excellent example of Herefordshire Council has just done a Citizens' Assembly on climate change, and they're linking the conclusions of the Citizens' Assembly to the budget setting process in Herefordshire. That's a really positive sign. We need better ways of tracking testing against trends, and that's the need. We need to improve appraisal methodology. Appraisal is very important, but at the moment, it has failed. It doesn't pass the Nolan test. An appraisal must answer the question, do spending decisions actually deliver the kind of infrastructure changes that we need to make? And appraisal must always test whatever comes out of the appraisal process against, would behavioural change do more? Would it be a better use of money, value for money, a more attractive benefit cost ratio? Next. Right, now, so that I'm not just whinging and using this opportunity to rant a little bit, I'm trying to bring all this together now, and I see this as an appraisal project, and I would welcome any comments. I'm talking to the Welsh Government, and I'm saying, right, we've got this attractive region in North Wales, and about 600,000 people, and we're going to throw the kitchen sink at it. Everything that I've said and seen and observed and worked on in Sweden and Denmark and Germany and the Netherlands, we're going to do it and fund it and work out how those funds can be supplied and how they perform better in terms of value for money than other ways of doing it. And we're going to test it all out on one specific region in North Wales for 600,000 people with a large amount of behavioural change, and we will produce zero carbon, maximum public health gains, a strong local economy, and actually improve quality of life. I think that's the end. Is there another slide, please? Good. I'm very pleased there isn't. Thank you for staying with me this amount of time.
Well, thank you so much, John, and also to Phil for two very, very inspiring presentations. I've certainly learned a lot in the last half an hour, and thank you so much. I must, one thing is I must go and visit Lund. So thanks, John, for inspiring me to do that. Now we're just going to pause from the presentations and move into our panel discussion with the questions and points that you're raising in the chat. If you're listening to this live on YouTube as we're recording it, please do continue to add your points and questions. We've had some great ones coming in already. But to kick off our panel session, I'm going to ask our two other experts with us today, Jillian and Chris, to give their observations and comments on what we've heard and on the subject matter. And I'd just like to remind my fellow panelists that we're on face to view when we're speaking. So we need to remember to mute and unmute as we speak and stop speaking. So with that, without any more ado, Jillian, what's your take on this subject and what we've heard?
Thank you, Roger. And firstly, a huge thanks to Phil and to John. I mean, not just for the presentations today, but obviously for all the work that they've done tirelessly on this agenda, and hopefully will continue to do so. I have lots of thoughts and they're difficult to organise. I found this quite difficult to organise this for a quick response. So I'm going to give it a go and make some comments, firstly about appraisal, the system of appraisal. What is it? What could it be? And secondly, what do we need to appraise? And of course, those two things are very linked. But I'm finding myself with a bit of a problem with any of the discussions relating to transport decarbonisation and appraisal that I have been witness to over recent times. And it's because I think that the discussions range from talking in some great detail about our system of appraisal here in the UK and how to tweak it to be better. So that's a very technical set of arguments, which is not actually necessarily suggesting that we need to throw that system out altogether. But other aspects of the discussion around appraisal are actually talking much more broadly about how we make good decisions and how we make the decisions that we need to make at the local level, at the wider scale, at the strategic level, and so on. And these are just such huge, they're vital topics, obviously they are, but they're actually really quite different, it seems to me. So the question of UK appraisal system, web tag, John actually almost near the very end of his presentation to me sort of said something that resonated with my niggly thing, which was, you know, the Danish, I think it was, said, oh, we've got, you know, all this fantastic information and in the UK that we use. And I think our appraisal system has been called, perhaps not by them, but as world beating. And yet no one else has it, and they get better outcomes. And so surely the first fundamental point in this discussion is, are we talking about changing the current, adapting and sort of refreshing the current appraisal system, or are we talking about chucking it out completely? And really looking at where the best examples are of what we're aiming to achieve are on the ground, and how did they do it? What were the tools that they used? And then that then spins us off into, I mean, you know, there's so many issues in our current system around, frankly, the vested interests, particularly in private consultancy around doing appraisal. And in my part of the world, my specific institute and others who train specifically around appraisal and don't even think to question whether or not this is a system that we don't need at all. You know, we are training the future generation to do and carry on with this system. So I'd really just like to go back to basics and talk about, you know, what are we talking about here? Chucking it out or tweaking it? And then secondly, it's about what needs to be appraised, because it also struck me with a lot of John's examples, as it does, and some on the call here will have heard me say this kind of thing, about how we can look over to the continent and identify all kinds of great examples. And we can look at the mode share figures, we can compare Freiburg and Oxford and so on, we can look at the mode shares. But when we look at Germany and when we look at the per capita carbon emissions, average per capita carbon emissions from personal travel in Germany, they are just as high, if not higher, than they are here. And so, again, when we're talking about appraisal, we're not just talking about this scheme or this city. We have to reduce carbon everywhere, and everywhere, and nowhere is the same. Everywhere has different baselines to work from. They have, different challenges. And it's also things like, we can look at Freiburg, but did they start with the 40%, 50% car mode share that Oxford is and reduce down to 20%? If not, where are the examples of where that level of cut has happened? Not where we've got the current mode share, but where that level of cut has happened. And what would an appraisal or an evaluation look like to figure out what the best modes interventions are, particularly then, given the social ramifications of trying to get the scale of car reduction at the speed and over the timeline that we need to. I personally don't think that has happened anywhere. You can look at your Zurichs, your Copenhagen's, your Amsterdam's, fantastic modal share, but it didn't start from where we're starting at. And that's a really, really important issue around how we actually make decisions and what we're assessing and over what spatial scale and time scale. So just a couple of kind of main points that have been rattling around for me.
Thanks ever so much. They're absolutely fantastic points, very valid indeed. I'm going to move straight on to Chris because time is starting to run away with us. I'm aiming for those of you watching live and working busy schedules, we're aiming to finish at 1:30. And just to also mention that to clarify to my fellow panelists, we can be unmuted because we're all in panel view, so everyone can see all five of us at the moment. Chris, let's come to you.
Hi, yes, thank you very much indeed. As an appraisal practitioner, I note and I sympathise with Jillian, Phil and John's concerns. I fully endorse all of John's very pointed key messages, and I come in peace. At TfL, we spend several £billion a year renewing and enhancing our network. We have nearly 1,000 live schemes and initiatives on the go at any one time. We have a transport network in London that is widely regarded to be directly responsible for around 10 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions per year, which is a big deal. And it's an even bigger deal when one considers the indirect impacts that transport, land use, planning, policies can have in influencing household emissions. Now, I don't think our appraisal system is broken, but I do think it needs surgery. And there are three things I'd like to raise that TfL are doing to try and enhance appropriate accounting of the full range of impacts, including carbon, in project appraisal. Firstly is an emphasis on multi-criteria appraisal. This is the full range of environmental, social and economic impacts of investment, not just those most easily monetized, and ensuring that we set this information out accessibly for decision makers. Often they like nothing more than a one-side color-coded table. They don't want to, and they don't tend to like piecing together different sections from very comprehensive, several tens of pages, business cases. And this can sometimes be the reason why a benefit cost ratio or a BCR is the single thing that decision makers are interested in. So diluting the fixation on benefit cost ratios by setting out multi-criteria analysis is crucial and really important. We are attempting at TfL to have a common set of 15 or so strategic outcomes against which the performance of all initiatives can be appraised, so that there is a common currency there. And as it happens, carbon accounts for two of these. One of these is TfL's carbon emissions as an organisation. What can we directly influence? And another is a much broader overall transport network life cycle estimate of carbon emissions impacts. So that's the first thing, an emphasis on multi-criteria appraisal. The second is an emphasis on considering the merit of initiatives in different circumstances, including those which are not a continuation of current conditions. And that is perhaps where current appraisal guidance points us towards. So, for example, if one looks at removing or downgrading one of the many gyratory systems we have in London's town centres, Wandsworth, Catford, Vauxhall, Wimbledon, Kingston, Hammersmith, the list goes on, this immediately flags a huge monetized disbenefit in terms of the additional journey time incurred by general traffic, which far outweighs any project benefits. And this is compounded by a central case forecast that general traffic levels will continue to increase over time. And this is all the more reason why a fixation on a single benefit cost ratio is unhealthy. And at this point, it is worth reflecting on a key line that the DfT's transport decarbonisation plan published last summer carried, albeit it was buried on page 158, which endorses the sentiment in Phil's presentation. This is says we need to move away from transport planning based on predicting future demand to provide capacity, predict and provide, to planning that sets outcomes that communities want to achieve and provides the transport solutions to deliver those outcomes, sometimes referred to as vision and validate. Now at TfL, we have a series of visions and action plans for each of the modes to try and set the framework for bringing these visions to life. We now need to make sure that the appraisal circumstances and scenarios against which different initiatives are assessed catch up and match those visions. Switching values. So this is an important approach in appraisal. This is about identifying the circumstances in which investment may make sense. At what point does an assumption need to change to warrant a value for money category shift, for example. Increasing the use of that, increasing the transparency around that is very important in the appraisal products that we generate. And one of the strands to this is accounting for uncertainty. COVID, Brexit have shone a torch on the importance of appraisal accounting for a range of different cost, benefit, demand, deliverability scenarios. We often devise and develop schemes which are many years in the gestation and many more years in the operation. A business case for Crossrail, if we made it today, would have costs and benefits that look very different to the one which underpinned the bill that got royal assent in 2008, and not just in the breadth of effects that it considered, which was much narrower than what an appraisal of a scheme like that today would look like. And unlike some of the agencies which Phil mentioned in use of Bayes' new carbon values, which almost doubled overnight when they were reissued last summer, Transport for London are using these, and some schemes, such as our several £100 million proposition to electrify the bus fleet in London, went from being poor value for money to medium overnight. A real step forward and a real help in ensuring that initiatives which tackle carbon emissions are given appropriate priority. So the second point is an emphasis on considering how different schemes will perform in a wide range of circumstances. The third element then, isolating the effects of individual schemes, but also being able to know what everything adds up to. This is a particular challenge at Transport for London with such a diverse and significant set of investments that we are trying to make. Attributing impacts to specific investments can be very tricky, but we're trying. Is the new segregated cycle infrastructure, cycle parking, or the safer junctions? Is it which one of them, or is it a little bit of all of it that has led to mode shift away from the car in a given area or corridor? Or is it nothing to do with any of those initiatives, and it's the costs of driving or the inconvenience of travelling by other modes and public transport, for example? So attempting to put our finger on what it is and what effects different initiatives have is a very important part of the work that we are trying to do. Just back to carbon specifically, we're promoting carbon literacy amongst our planners, sponsors and project delivery teams. It is a relatively new effect to measure, and baseline evidence, unit rates and rules around direct and indirect effects is crucial when we are on our way to embedding it as a key measure that sits alongside every piece of information that is put to decision makers. Now, we're definitely not perfect, and there is a huge amount to do to make sure that we can meet our targets and commitments, particularly with regard to carbon and climate change. It's a bumpy road, but we're trying to make sure that we inform decision makers as appropriately as possible. My final thought is this, however, that how we make sure the evidence is listened to by government decision makers is an equivalent, if not the greater challenge, although it might well perhaps be the topic of next week's seminar. Thank you.
That's very good, Chris. Actually, interestingly, that very point is one of the many questions that has come through, which hopefully we will get time to come to. We've now got half an hour, my fellow panelists, to deal with some of the many questions that are raised. And Phil, I'm going to come to you first with the very first question that came in, which is from the Transport Action Network. What evidence is there for the outcomes / impacts that you listed under the runaway climate change, making the point that the National Highways dismisses them and says the economy won't be affected that much? So what is there any evidence or outcomes? What will you say, Phil?
Well, I suppose one has to say with some satisfaction that we have not had the experience of the entire world structure of human relationships being destroyed by climate change. To somebody who says the only evidence they'd accept is demonstration that it's actually happened, I'd say, no, that won't do. I mean, it's an entirely different sort of evidence. It is the evidence that the IPCC network of world scientists, thousands and thousands of people involved in research and analysis at the highest level, have brought together, establishing the nature of the relationship between carbon and climate, the nature of the trajectories that we're on. And until the only way of proving that right, I suppose, is to let it happen. And we can't do that. I don't think that National Highways is on a strong bat of challenging the evidence base. That's not the nature of their argument, and they don't try and do so. What they try to do is carve out a little separate niche for themselves where their bit of it doesn't matter. I think it would be inconceivable if they tried to defend their support for the policies that they've engaged in, projects they've engaged in for half a century, by saying there's no evidence it does any harm. That I think just won't wash. The nature of scientific evidence, I think, has to be dealt with on a scientific level, and those you have at the last resort to make your mind up about which are the convincing arguments and which are the unconvincing ones. I expect that the majority of people involved in this discussion today know perfectly well what the balance of the scientific evidence that they're convinced by is.
Thanks, Phil. Any other thoughts from other panelists on that? If not, we'll move to thanks, Phil. We'll move to a question from Andrew Boswell. What should we be asking for in the NPS review to get better appraisal? And for the non-experts who are watching, including myself in this case, perhaps we could just explain what the acronyms NPS is. Who'd like to come in on that? Phil, yeah.
Yeah, I'll just sort of kick off on that one. The NPS is the document that I referred to at some length, where the loophole was outlined. It's a big document of general principles supposed to apply to road networks and rail networks, the nationally strategic important ones. And as I said, a very large part of it is entirely sensible, and some parts of it are appallingly bad. My feeling about the absolute priority in the review is this loophole has to be deleted. It's just got to come out. It's poisoning everything else that the statement tries to do. There are some other things. It's not comfortable on the difference between geographically specific transport projects and generic, non-geographically specific policies. And that has to be that has to be improved, I think. But I'd say getting rid of that loophole would be one enormous step forward.
Okay, thank you. Jillian, on that, and then I'll also come to you for the next question, if that's okay.
Okay, just on that question, I would have thought surely that something like that has to be explicitly in alignment with the Green Book, and the Green Book review clearly stated that carbon and net zero targets have not only got to be in there, but they can't be traded off against other priorities either. So I've just this sort of issue of, you know, what is compliant with respect to net zero is what the Green Book is asking for, and that's what needs to be in there.
Indeed. Good, thank you. I'm coming to you with this one, Jillian, because I think you recall you did touch on this subject, and it's from Becca Lush. Should appraisal be conducted by a truly independent third party to ensure independence and value for money, rather than by the scheme promoter or consultants who rely on giving the promoter the answer they want? I think I know what your answer will be.
Well, yes, I completely agree with that. I certainly, unfortunately, it's very difficult. You can't see the participants and who's actually on the call, but I would imagine there's some people related to consultancies or in consultancies, but frankly, they're just, they don't have the level of independence by virtue of how they're funded, who the paymasters are.
But surely they have a vested interest, clearly, but we need them as well, don't we? We have to have expert consultants to assist in looking at these matters.
We do. Again, though, I mean, a lot of the things that we've been talking about, I think, do require that back to basics issue. And you know, Chris mentioned many of them working on the ground. You know, what is the evidence base in the first place that needs to be used to do the appraisal? So we need more work on that, and that you know, there's a lot of work for consultancies in that in itself. But I think yes to Becca's question, I would say I think we also need an independent something very specific around transport and carbon in terms of an independent monitoring body around our progress towards net zero. So we have a situation with the Department for Transport, who are not publishing the figures behind their decarbonisation plan. They're suggesting they're only going to review it in 5 years' time, aviation in 10 years' time. And yet we need annual review of that baseline of where we are on that trajectory. So there's quite a lot, I would suggest, that needs to be thought about in terms of the governance of this.
John, you want to come in, please do.
Yeah, Jillian has largely answered the question, I think, but I think this is so very important. I just wanted to add a little bit more emphasis.
Please do.
In my strange career, for example, as a counsellor, we always had to declare if we had any interests. In the years when I was the editor of a transport journal, we had a very rigorous procedure for asking authors to give us information on whether there were any interest they needed to declare. You know, did they work for any organisation, were they in receipt of any financial payments? And the whole transport world in the United Kingdom, it's bigger than appraisal, actually, at this point. It's not fit for purpose. There's no declaration of interest, there's no independent scrutiny. People use the word independent, and there's nothing really independent. And that really applies to, if I build a bypass around Shrewsbury, will it reduce congestion in Shrewsbury? You know, if I say will improve air quality, will it improve air quality? If I say will create local jobs, will it? You know, there absolutely has to be a completely new structure, a completely new organization. Many years ago, 20, maybe even 30 years ago, I gave evidence to, does it still exist? The Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution. And they seem to operate in that way, you know, as a genuinely independent body. In Germany, I have colleagues who present cases to a federal constitutional court, for example, and I don't think we have anything like that in Britain. But at the moment, transport planning policy spending is drowning in unsubstantiated false assertions, absolutely dripping. I've been through many different interactions with people that I do have friendly conversations with, and they say that building a new road will relieve congestion. And I just say, okay, is this place 75,000 people or 150,000 people? Let's get that right. Now, name me 3 places in the United Kingdom where we've done it, where we built a bypass or built, and it did relieve congestion. And no one in 20 years has answered that question. They won't answer. They just go silent. You know, we need a completely independent, new administrative, quasi-legal structure like the German Federal Constitutional Court, where you can go and challenge the scientific basis, the evidential stuff that is being thrown in it. And we're spending, my last count was £34 billion committed expenditure on building new roads. Right, that's not all. That's the the biggie RIS2, together with the other thing I take great interest in, LLM or whatever it is, local major roads, and it comes to about 34 billion. And there aren't many areas of public policy where we can spend 34 billion by waving a hand and considering the back of the fag packet as the evidence for our spending. So we do need to set up a structure. I've got some ideas for another discussion perhaps on what that might look like, based on Germany, based on Sweden, but we need that, and it has to be genuinely independent.
Interestingly,
sorry about the ranting.
No, not at all. It's wonderful, John. Interestingly, in the chat, Susan Dye has mentioned the UK used to have independent government laboratories as an analogy. And I also pick out Chris, I'm sure it's Chris Todd from Transport Action Network makes the point. The problem is the decision has often already been taken for a road, but without any real assessment of alternatives and whether spending money on a road is the best use of public money. I mean, in a way, that was what you were saying, John, about the Shrewsbury Road with that awful photograph you showed. And Deborah McConnell mentions she says, yes, I agree, Chris, the default is build a road. There's no serious consideration of alternatives, and Highways England is not accountable. How do we change the culture? It needs change at government level. Chris, that in a way, that was a point you were making, but also one or two people in the chat have been mentioning about the Silvertown Road. So Chris, what's your take on this point that's being made about decisions already been taken and independent assessments of it?
Very good question. I agree with John that it is very difficult to find someone or a group who is truly independent. And for me, what is most important with appraisal is transparency around assumptions and allowing those assumptions to be scrutinized and probed, because there is an awful lot of storytelling that can be done by leaning on a critical assumption in a certain way. Now, Silvertown Tunnel, tricky one. What is in its favour are the economic and non-private vehicle opportunities that it will open up on both sides of the river in an area of London which is significantly deprived. It will also be part of a tolling regime that covers the tunnel and the existing neighbouring tunnel, the Blackwall Tunnel, that will have an ability to manage demand and hold some of the forecasts and predictions around traffic flow, environmental effects to account. John's point about appraisal not having accountability, I think there are opportunities for controversial decisions to have a greater set of controls imposed upon them in the way in which they are operated, which can allow for accountability back to a certain set of outcomes being achieved. And I think what is happening with the Silvertown Tunnel allows that. I think building a bypass or a road which is not subject to any measures which can fetter and influence how it is subsequently used is much more ripe for the approach of a skewed appraisal simply being written to satisfy decision makers, confirming a decision which they have already taken.
Right. Thank you. That's really helpful. I'll leave it there because I know we could have a whole hour and a half on the Silvertown Tunnel. So I'll draw a line under that. But also just to mention, while we're talking about roads and not having new roads, I've been reminded to give a shout out to what's happening in Wales, because there is some really exciting stuff, I think, going on, as John highlighted, particularly in North Wales, but really across the whole nation. And the Welsh Roads Review Board definitely should get a shout out. That's for sure. Right, I'm going to move on to the next question from my colleague Trustee Mark Frost. Is the problem really with the process of economic appraisal, or do we just need to make sure the options we are appraising and choosing between are the right ones? This would require strengthening the option setting process in the strategic outline business case. It sounds like it's what Denmark do when they get it right on the ground. Who'd like to comment on Mark's interesting point there? Phil, thank you.
I quibble with one word from Mark on that, the word just. I think any statement we just need to is almost certainly going to be wrong. But I'm absolutely convinced that one of the huge weaknesses in what we do at present is the narrowness of the range of alternatives which are considered from the beginning, but not only at the beginning, throughout the entire process of appraisal, planning and implementation. And it's a closure which is particularly harmful at a time where the planning process can take many years and the policy priorities are changing more swiftly than the planning processes. I mean, some of the large-scale schemes which are now being appraised and implemented were dreamed up 5 years or 10 years ago, and some even longer, to meet entirely different contexts. They absolutely don't correspond with the world as it is now. And there has to be a way of stopping this momentum where a scheme is deemed to be right because somebody 10 years ago did an appraisal on different criteria we use now. So there has to be a way of pulling the plug, really. I think maybe that's one of the problems with Silvertown. Okay, we draw a line under that, but it is the case that Silvertown is a rather peculiar project in that many of the people who are most consistent and understanding supporters of TfL in the progressive and wonderful initiatives they've made over decades simply don't understand how this scheme could have found its way into the programme. I'd count myself in that. It simply doesn't make sense, and there has to be a way of doing it. I do think there's a special issue of when it's the word promoter in the planning system in England in particular. The word promoter has a very important meaning. A scheme has to have a promoter to seek approval and so on. And it doesn't do anybody any favors if the promoter is the appraiser. There's simply the process of building up a consensus when it's so deeply embedded that this is a scheme of which there is only one acceptable answer to the appraisal, which is it's a good scheme, cannot be the right way of getting projects and policies which are really useful.
Interestingly, that's coming through in the comments in the chat as well, Phil, as we're going along. John, you want to come in?
Yeah, just a quick word, if I may, on the whole thing about options, which goes back to things we've been saying about scrutiny and about beefing the whole system up. I've been making quite as part of my fellowship funded work of the mobility as a service system idea. And it goes back to the project I did in York, where we actually produced a 15% reduction in car trips, funded by DFT. Thank you, DFT, for the York Intelligent Travel Project. I think we have to find a way to, whatever the word is, beef everything up. In other words, if somebody wants to build a road, they have to present evidence that they've tried the demand management, York Intelligent Travel, mobility as a service. In other words, they've got deeply into behavioural change and what produces behavioural change. People do. We spent 20, 30 years on sustainable transport stuff, looking at modal shift. We understand modal shift. I've done loads of work in focus groups on why people don't walk or don't cycle or don't use the bus and what they want to put in place, but what's missing from all this is some kind of formal legislative testing rigor and robustness that underpins appraisal. So, okay, Council XYZ wants to build a nice new road, or TfL want to build the Silvertown Tunnel or whatever. Right, show us what you've done in the past 5 years to shift car trips to the alternative to the car, shift freight trips away from whatever kind of vehicle the freight was on to alternatives, and let's monitor that, measure that, and see how that's gone. And if it isn't working very well, we could consider the physical infrastructure option. But we don't do behavioural change. We just don't do it. And to have that appraisal, the web-based transport appraisal guidance was saying we must include that as one of the options, and we don't do it. So how can we beef it up? And I think the only way to beef it up is to say you don't get 1 penny of funding for your tunnel, your bridge, your road, your bypass, or whatever, until you've met the test of what you can achieve through behavioural change and demand management.
Excellent. Well said, John.
Can I add a point to that?
Please do.
It's this issue of modelling. I mean, I do think modelling has a very important place in scientific and rigorous analysis anyway. I mean, in all fields of scientific activity. So I'm not an anti-modeler, but I do think we have the balance completely wrong when we do £1 million+ projects to create a model forecasting the future, and then spend peanuts on evaluation after the event of whether it actually worked out that way. And I see the priority in investigations as building up a library of revealed experience, what actually has worked, monitored over several years, not just one ex post appraisal, and with proper I've got a bit of a problem about independence. Nobody's completely independent in these things. Everybody has ideologies and political views and scientific views and so on. But nevertheless, to have the appraisal of the evaluation after the event every year, checking back what went right, what went wrong, is bound to be success. And then what you've got is the ability to do evaluation and appraisal based on experience, not just based on experience of doing models. Do think that helped.
Thanks, Phil. I'm coming to you, Jillian, and then just to let my fellow panelists know, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I wanted to try and squeeze in 2 more questions. Jillian.
I mean, just a couple of other things in response to Mark's point. I think there are some really big things that would need to happen before you even got to the point of thinking about what the options were. So you would need to be much clearer about what the goals are for a start. When you have a goal such as net zero in 2050, it doesn't actually then command any consensus on the degree to which we can reach that goal through technology, whether we're talking about a trajectory and a pathway, or whether we're just talking about the end goal. Things like to what extent are we going to factor in embodied emissions into the different options that we're going to appraise. There are, well, to keeping on the ball with respect to climate change, then there's quite a big battle before you can even think about what the options are to agree on what the actual ways of accounting, strategic sort of goals underneath that strategic goal about how you achieve this, whether we are going to think about the next 10 years, which is the most important because we would have blown it after that anyway. So what can we get done within 10 years? Forget this 60, 100-year timeline for appraisal. We've actually got to look at the options that are available to us to achieve deep cuts within 10 years. That's your, there's all these filters. I haven't said them in the right order, but there's all these filters before you can even get to thinking about what the options are then possible to achieve those aims.
Yeah, absolutely. Talking of net zero, the next question I want to come to is in a way on that theme. Climate change is an existential threat, the questioner says, for our planet and our species. And the IPCC, as we know, recently made clear we're just years to respond. The question is, should we be funding any initiatives that have a chance at increasing carbon emissions, irrespective of any wider benefits that appraisal may identify? Should there not be a stop-go point on this before any further detailed appraisal takes place? Quick answers around the panel on that. Are we all nodding and saying yes?
I'd say
Phil. Yes, Phil, then John.
Yes-ish. I am comfortable with the idea that it may be possible to make an extraordinarily good case occasionally, but if one starts with the presumption no to carbon increasing activity and only give way on that in very exceptional cases, I think that's probably the way to go.
Thanks, John. And then I'll come to Jillian and then Chris, and then we'll come to our final question.
Yeah, no, I would repeat a point that Jillian made. I think that once we have a very, very clear specification of what our objectives are, what we're trying to achieve, then the whole question becomes a lot easier to answer. I am absolutely convinced, based upon lots of discussions in terms of citizens' assemblies and scientific stuff and sustainable transport stuff around the world, absolutely convinced that any objective that any public body wishes to state in support of any infrastructure project of any kind whatsoever can be achieved 100% by non-road building, non-tunnel building, non-infrastructure, no concrete, no steel and no tarmac. We can do it. And I'm willing to present that to the independent scrutiny, the Federal Constitutional Court or whatever, so it's a more fundamental problem. That actually the things we worry about are relatively easy to solve. Once we get out of this kind of ridiculous rabbits caught in the headlights, our first thought is, where can we pour concrete, steel or tarmac?
Yeah, thanks, John. Jillian, your take.
I think that we have to not even allow things that have it. We can't allow things that even have a chance of increasing carbon at the moment. The point being that we will know within fairly short amount of time whether we're getting ourselves onto the right pathway. And after that point, maybe we can. Good. When we've got more headroom, when we've got more options, when we figure out whether we can have things like carbon capture and storage, I doubt it, but if we figure that out, then maybe we've got more options. At the moment, we have no options. We have nowhere to go. We have no wriggle room. We have to say no, no, no right now.
Thank you. Chris, do you agree with that?
Yes, in principle. I don't think we can rip up the rule book and not have some things that we say the price is too high to put a value. I think we can and I think we should put a much higher price on the value of carbon, I would be anxious about saying that there are some things that shouldn't be valued at all. John Prescott, in the wake of, I think it was Ladbroke Grove, one of the rail crashes approaching Paddington, said that no price is too high to pay for safety. And I think in practice, the way the world works is one has to attempt to put a value on things.
Fine. Thank you so much, Chris. The final question is from Rosie Pearson, and it's, how do we get government decision makers to take heed of all the things we're hearing today? Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but therefore my plea is that everyone who's watching this live or in due course, tweet, email, contact government decision makers and give them the YouTube link to this presentation, because what we've heard today from Phil, from John, from Jillian and from Chris, and also all in the chat, all of the contributions you've made have been absolutely illuminating. I have certainly learned a lot that I didn't know an hour and a half ago, and I'm very grateful to our 4 panelists. Thank you so much, Phil, John, Jillian and Chris. And also, as I mentioned, my colleague trustee Lisa for putting all of this together. I hope you found it interesting. The Foundation for Integrated Transport is there if you think we can help you. Have a look at our website. We will be organising further webinars. Look out for the next one later in the year. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you.